Hey there, you guys. Thank you for joining me once again in the Holy Shed. And do you know what? I've been flat out with stuff for the past couple of days. Well, most of the last week, actually. And I don't mean watching the Euros, by the way. Enough said. So, if you don't mind, tonight I'm going to just jump straight into our subject. And I think you've probably picked up by now that I'm doing a short season here in the shed around the subject of how to read the Bible and still be a Christian, which I know may sound a bit weird, well, a lot weird actually to some people, but really it all depends on what your experience of the Bible has been or what it is. Howard Thurman, who was a spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King, tells a moving and revealing story about his grandmother in the Bible. And this is what he writes. I'm going to bring it up on my screen so I get it right. He says, "My regular chore was to do all of the reading for my grandmother. She could neither read nor write. With a feeling of great temerity, I asked her one day why it was that she would never let me read from Paul's letters. What she told me I shall never forget. During the days of slavery, she said, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Always, the white minister used as his text something from St. Paul. At least 3 or 4 times a year he used the text, 'Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ.' And then he would go on to show how if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. Well, I promised my Maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I would never, ever read that part of the Bible." Pretty powerful, isn't it? And you know, the preacher's text was in the Bible, sure enough, but the lady contested it because she believed that if the Bible didn't tally with her understanding of God as a God of love who created all human beings equal, then the Bible was wrong. So you see, it really does all depend on where you're coming from. In her wonderful book, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, Jeanette Winterson talks about her experience of growing up in a religious home, in a background where the Bible was used as a weapon against her when she came out as a lesbian. And you know, I've got endless stories of LGBT people and others in other walks of life for whom the Bible has been anything but friendly, anything but helpful. So, to begin this evening, we're going to have a candle moment. We're going to light a candle for anyone who has been or is abused and oppressed with the Bible or with religion, which is supposed to be a means of knowing God's love, but sometimes turns out to be a source of pain and oppression. Well, maybe that's you. And if it is, light the candle for yourself. Let's light a candle to lift up all those people for whom the Bible and religion has been anything but a source of goodness. And rather than a prayer at this point, as we ponder our candle, I'd like to just remind you of something that is said in 1 John, the first epistle of John, where the writer says this. He says, God is love. God is love. And those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves again and again and again that the hallmark, the undeniable proof that God is present, that God is speaking, is love. And whatever source it comes from, when we experience love, we are experiencing God. Amen. So a couple of sheds ago, I think it was, I was talking here about the story of the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3. And you'll remember I took serious issue with the typical interpretation of that passage in which Eve is depicted as basically the original sinner, the one who ate the fruit, the forbidden fruit, and then seduced Adam into eating it too. And as a result of her action, it's not in the text at all, but what we've been told is that as a result of this, sin and guilt entered the human bloodline and, like some pernicious STD, became transmitted to our entire race, which means, so we're told, that we all stand condemned before God. Well, there are a lot of issues I can take with that, as you know. But the consequence of this version of the story in terms of Eve is that she is forever seen as the guileful, naive maybe, but guileful and naive seductress who succumbed to the wiles of the devil and became the doorway for sin, man's downfall, the eternal scapegoat. Well, I don't need to go over it all again. I've argued in the shed and in a couple of my books that instead of being the villain of the piece in this story, to me, Eve is actually the courageous hero who symbolically triggered human evolution so that we became moral beings who know right from wrong and make moral choices. Which is why I maintain that the story of Eden is not about paradise lost. It's about paradise outgrown. It's not about original sin, the origin of sin. It's about the birth of conscience and moral agency. And as we saw last week, the first mention of sin in the whole of the Bible isn't in the Garden of Eden. It's in a field. The field where Cain murdered his brother Abel. The original biblical sin is violence. It's not eating apples. It's not sex or lust with which the church seems to be eternally obsessed. No, the original sin is violence. However, this perception of Eve as the one who opened the door to sin has cast a long shadow well beyond herself on to women in general, who are seen often, to use the phrase, as the weaker sex in more ways than just physical. It was the influential early church leader Tertullian who described women as the gateway of the devil. And throughout history, the Bible has been used to keep women in subjection to men and to hinder their emancipation, not just because of Eve in the garden, but because the whole background of the Bible is patriarchal. That's the society in which the biblical events and writings came into being. And this is naturally, therefore, reflected in some of its stories and its teachings. It also contains stories of hideous abuse of women that go tragically unchallenged in the narratives. Phyllis Tribble, great name, Phyllis Tribble, in her little book Texts of Terror, Literary Feminist Readings of Biblical Narratives. She focuses in this book on 4 biblical stories of rejection, rape, dismemberment and sacrifice of women. She's looking at the stories of Hagar, Tamar, an unnamed concubine, and Jephthah's daughter. And as Phyllis Tribble points out, in 2 of those stories, God seems just absent, and in the others, God seems to be almost exclusively on the side of the powerful, the abuser. Now, of course, the representation of God in these and other biblical stories is the work of the narrator. And as we've been seeing, Midrash, the Jewish practice of interpreting scripture, Midrash prompts us to interrogate the text, to ask, who's telling this story and why? What's his agenda? And they're all his's, by the way, they're all written by men. What's his agenda? And I can't help wondering how different some stories, certainly those ones, but how some stories would be told if they were being narrated by a woman writer. Now, in another book, lots of books tonight, in another book called Bread Not stone the challenge of feminist biblical interpretation, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza argues that if the Bible is not to continue as a tool for the oppression of women, only the non-sexist, non-patriarchal, non-oppressive traditions of biblical interpretation can be accorded the theological authority of divine revelation. That's quite a strong statement, but it's one that I completely go along with. I mean, I too can't accept as divine revelation any portrayal of women or any statement about women in the Bible or in Christian theology or anywhere else that upholds the oppression of women or presents women as in any way unequal to men. I can't see that, read that, or hear that and say, this is the word of the Lord. And if I thought that God was in any way at all okay about the oppression or suppression of women, I would be an atheist overnight, no question. I mean, actually, I'd be an atheist in the name of God, the God I do believe in. Thankfully, I don't believe that. And I long ago abandoned the fetish, and that's how I would see it, the fetish of what's called biblical inerrancy. You know, the idea that everything in the Bible is literally true or accurately represents God. The Bible is a human book. Now that sounds staggering on one level for a lot of people, but of course it is. The Bible is a human book written by men, however divinely inspired, by men, by people who were influenced by their social, cultural and historical experiences. And that is such an obvious statement, and yet to some people it sounds like heresy. And so therefore it's essential that we read the Bible critically, but also with an open heart to hear God speak through it, to receive the wisdom. And I need to state this very clearly, guys. To read the Bible with a critical eye as well as an open heart is not heresy. It's just good, responsible, sensible reading practice, making use actually of God-given powers of reason. And into the bargain, by the way, being able to read the Bible that way is likely to help us to read it and still be a Christian. So look, the Bible isn't a feminist tract. Duh, of course it isn't. Trying to make the Bible or Homer or Shakespeare feminist or judging their texts from a feminist perspective is basically silly and incongruous. Feminism is a modern ideology dating back no further than the late 19th century. There are bound to be things in any ancient text that today will make us squirm because, you know, social sensibilities have changed and evolved, and thank God for that. But we need, I think, to call out sexism and other discriminatory biases, not defend them out of some false loyalty to a book instead of fidelity to justice, love and goodness, and the God of justice, love and goodness. Now, all of that said, there are also very positive portrayals of women in the Bible. Jesus certainly went against the grain in his patriarchal society by treating women with dignity and respect. I've pointed out in the past how I think he genuinely did apologize to the so-called Syrophoenician woman because of the attitudes that he expressed toward her that could easily be interpreted as prejudiced. But overall, I think Jesus is seen as treating women with loving respect. But there are other passages too. One of my favourites, which I want us just to pause on this evening for a few moments, is at the beginning of the book of Exodus, where Pharaoh ordered the midwives to kill off all Hebrew male babies at birth. Why? Because he was paranoid about the slave population of the Israelites multiplying and growing and thriving, and perhaps, overwhelming his own population. Hey, the story doesn't change with history, does it? But two midwives, who unusually are given names, Shipra and Puah, these two midwives, it says, feared God. And in a very, very, very dangerous act of civil disobedience against the most ruthless and powerful person in their world, they refused to murder the little boys. But they were smart about it, outwitting Pharaoh by trapping him in his own racism. The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, they said. They're vigorous and they give birth before we can even arrive. I mean, this is suggesting that the Israelite women were like animals, that don't need any midwives. And of course, Pharaoh fell for it hook, line and sinker. So the Israelites continued to multiply through the canny, scheming and civil disobedience of two humble midwives. Fabulous, absolutely fabulous. But the genocide continued. So when Jochebed, as she is later identified, bears Moses, she decides that rather than allow the Egyptians to cast her son into the Nile, which is what they were doing, she would place him in the Nile herself, in a lovingly constructed waterproof basket. Probably wouldn't save him, but it was an act of defiant hope, whilst at the same time perversely conforming to Pharaoh's wishes. Enter the daughter of Pharaoh. I hope you're noticing, by the way, that this is all about amazing women, strong women in a patriarchal world. Why was the princess bathing in the Nile, which the story tells us? That was where poor people bathed. She lived in a palace with, baths and servants and everything. Why come to this public place of rubbish, sewerage and dead babies? Well, one midrashic view might be that this too was an act of civil disobedience. She disapproved of her father's brutality, and so bathing in the Nile was a statement of solidarity. She was cleansing herself in that dirty river. Jewish Midrash gives the princess a name, Bithiah, meaning daughter of God. Oh yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? The rabbis named the child of their persecutor daughter of God. And this Arab woman is still today held in high esteem in Jewish tradition. Some Midrashic writings say that she forsook Egypt along with the Israelites. She went with them and married Caleb, another heroic biblical figure whose name means rebel. So it's great, isn't it? A marriage of holy rebels. I can go with that. Seeing the basket with the child floating in the reeds, Bithiah sent a servant to fetch it, and hearing him cry, it says she felt compassion and decided to save him, to adopt him as her own. Ali Wiesel, the Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor, says that Bithiah knew it was a Hebrew child because, he says, it cried like an adult. A whole community was crying in the child. Moses' older sister Miriam saw all this because, she was close at hand, keeping an eye on him, refusing to believe that all hope was dead. And courageously she approached the princess and cunningly offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. And then, with glorious irony, she fetches Moses' own grief-stricken mother to care for him. What a story this is. What a story, with an incredible interfaith, interclass kind of storyline there of female solidarity, overcoming fear and tyranny and racial and religious hatred, all in the cause of saving a child. But also, I think that they were all doing what they were doing to nurture, to preserve and nurture their own inner humanity. Oh, and by the way, what further glorious irony that Jochebed ends up being paid from Pharaoh's own purse to nurse her own Hebrew child. Friends, this story is where the Exodus begins. This great narrative, a defining narrative of the Hebrew people, and which has become a defining narrative for many other oppressed peoples throughout history. This is what it is. The hero of Exodus, as we know, is a man, Moses. But where would he be? Where would Moses be if it were not for this crew of largely unrecognized women? But consider also the lines that were crossed here. You know, on the banks of the Nile, the daughter of Pharaoh and a young slave girl, Miriam, meet in a subversive, dangerous encounter. Each of the women involved, you know, two midwives, a slave mother and a daughter, and a princess, each of them had cause, great cause, to fear Pharaoh. And yet they still chose the path of courage, integrity, and compassion. But before long, the story reveals another child genocide, when we're told that the angel of the Lord passed through Egypt, slaying all the Egyptian children in homes that had no blood painted on the lintels of the door. Now this surely has to be another text of terror, doesn't it? And to demonstrate that poetry is sometimes a form of midrash, Eleanor Wilner, her poem Miriam's Song, probes the cracks in the text, linking the theme of child genocide in the Exodus story with the sacrifice of children in wars throughout history. This is the poem. I'm going to put it on the screen so that you can see the words and ponder them. Miriam's Song. Death to the firstborn sons, always the first fruits to the gods of men. She had not meant it so, standing in the reeds back then, the current tugging at her skirt like hands. She had only meant to save her little brother Moses, red-faced with rage, when he was given to the river. The long curve of the Nile would keep their line, the promised land around the bend. Years later, when the grey angel, like the smoke trail of a dying comet, passed by their houses with blood smeared over doorways, Miriam, her head hot in her hands, wept as the city swelled with the wail of Egypt's women. Then she straightened up, slowly plaited her hair and wound it tight around her head, drew her long white cloak with its deep blue threads around her, and went to join the others, to leave one ruler for another, one Egypt for the next. Some nights, you still can see her by some river where willows hang, listening to the heavy tread of armies, those sons once hidden dark in baskets. And in her mind she sees her sister, the black-eyed Pharaoh's daughter, lift the baby like a gift from brown flood waters and take him to save him. Such a pretty boy, so disarming as his dimpled hands reach out, his mouth already open for the breast. Well, amazing. And you know, it's a question, isn't it, that has to be asked. Christians, of course, delight in that whole storyline of the blood over the lintels and the Hebrew children saved and the Egyptian children slain. But you can't just read it and take it, can you? You have to ask questions. You have to interrogate that text. One of my favourite American writers, Frederick Buechner, a well-seasoned man in the art of his own form of midrash, he says this about the Bible. Let me read it for you. He says, in short, one way to describe the Bible, written by many different people over a period of 3,000 years and more, would be to say that it is a disorderly collection of 60-odd books, which are often tedious, barbaric, and obscure, and which teem with contradictions and inconsistencies. It is a swarming compost of a book, an Irish stew of poetry and propaganda, law and legalism, myth and murk, history and hysteria. Over the centuries, it has become hopelessly associated with tub-thumping evangelism and dreary piety with superannuated superstition and blue-nosed moralising, with ecclesiastical authoritarianism and crippling literalism. And he writes that, and then he says, and yet, just because it is a book about both the sublime and the unspeakable, it's a book also about life the way it really is. It's a book about people who are at one and the same time both believing and unbelieving, innocent and guilty, crusaders and crooks, full of hope and full of despair. In other words, he says, it's a book about us. And it's also, he says, a book about God. If it's not about the God we believe in, then it's about the God we do not believe in. One way or another, the story we find in the Bible is our own story. Well, look, I am a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and there are sentiments and narratives in the Bible that I find quite unchristian, inconsistent with the spirit and figure of Jesus. But I love wrestling with this book, with all that stuff that Frederick Buechner just said, with this Irish stew of a book, this compost heap. And it's interesting, compost heaps are basically the rotting remains of things that previously lived. And of course, the great thing is that compost heaps are used to cause other things to grow, other new plants to grow. And I think that's a very good description of the Bible. It's a collection of stories and accounts and statements about the history of different people, Hebrew people, Christian people, and I think it's there not just to be sat and kind of listened to like some dumb robots and then recited back parrot fashion. I think it's there to be engaged with, and that's why I say I love wrestling with this book, which I do find yields wisdom and insight about life, about God and about myself. But I do, sometimes more than others, I do have to wrestle hard with it sometimes to find those insights. And so I'm going to carry on with that, wrestling with some other more difficult texts. And if you've got some that you'd like to raise with me and flag up, please feel free to do that. But this evening is it's struggling with the Bible, but it's also celebrating women and celebrating at least one place that we can find there in the Bible where women are portrayed as strong, courageous, godly people who outwit the most powerful and abusive man in the world. And I think that women are still doing that today. So here's a prayer. Here's a prayer. Uncontainable God of all creation, lurking in holy books and not so holy stories, in sacred myths and troubled histories, glimpsed also in dawn risings and pink sunsets, in rustling breezes at the top of trees, in wispy summer clouds and freezing winter ice. We are grateful to be part of your dervish dance of delight throughout the universe, whirling through days and moments, exciting and mundane, toasting the mystery of something rather than nothing, reveling in each sacred breath that fills our hungry breast. May we never lose our sense of indebtedness or cease asking what is asked of us. And here's to you, voluptuous mystery of life, love that will not let us go. Here's to you. Well, I think guys, that is a cue for you to join me in a toast. So if you've got some drink handy, this would be your moment to pour it out or get it to hand. And I invite you, Shedsters, to join me in a toast to life, a toast to women and men, to all of us. learning to live together in mutual respect and true friendship. Here's to sharing fun and laughter, but also sorrow and tears, but sharing them. Friends to life. L'chaim. So, if you like what you're finding here, if you like being in the shed, you like what I'm doing, then you can support us through this coffee site. And the link is always at the top of the posts on the Holy Shed Facebook page. So if you want to do that, thank you so much. For those of you who do, it's very much appreciated. Now, just before I go, a couple of birds of the day I'd like to show you, really. This one. I love this picture. This is a little great tit. But when I looked at it, I thought, oh, the wonder of adolescence. Bad hair days, spotty faces. Lovely, lovely little creature. And rather more kind of impressive, perhaps visually, down at the coast last week, we saw this beautiful whimbrel. I've never seen a whimbrel before, actually. I'm familiar with them. I've seen lots of pictures, but I'd never seen one before. And, you know, the heart just misses a beat. Mine does, when I sometimes find these little creatures and I'm suddenly in the presence of them. It's wonderful. So, that's just about it for today. I'm going to play you a piece of music to finish with. Thanks for joining me, and do send in any thoughts that you have about the things I'm saying, and especially any parts of the Bible that you struggle with that you'd like to throw into the pot, into the Irish stew pot of these next few weeks. And so to finish with, I'm going to be playing you in just a moment a piece of music which I used in the Soul Space event that we had on Thursday, where we were looking at refugee people, and I played a piece by the Haneen Women's Choir, and I've got a picture of them, I think, somewhere here. Where are they? Yeah, here we go. Having a good old chatter. This is a female singing group that was founded in 2017, which performs traditional Syrian folk songs. It's a branch of the Haneen Cultural Forum, founded in Turkey a couple of years earlier. And the Forum is really a group of people who have been forcibly displaced, and particularly Syrian women, who decided to face their pain and suffering with intellectual and cultural empowerment. More strong women. It provides its participants with support in the struggles that they're having in readjusting to life outside of their homeland, as well as helping them to preserve their Syrian heritage. The forum's main objective is to create vocal groups within the Syrian diaspora. And the target group are women above the age of 50 with no musical experience, although they're very happy for anyone to join them. The project helps to connect its members with their homeland while they're in exile, and it's hoped that this bond will create a safe space from which these women can begin to build positive relations with their new environment. So the songs are sung in a number of different languages, but all languages that are part of Syria. So I'm going to play that to you in just a moment. But before I go, again, thanks for being here. Hope you have a lovely week this week. Be very kind to yourselves in these challenging times. Be kind to those around you. Stay human. And I'll be seeing you again very soon. Enjoy this.
ولادك